Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these heterodox conversations for complexity. Hello there, and thank you for your ears and your attention. We're happy to have you. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of Thought Stretchers Education, and I'm also the host of this podcast. Before we get to the content of this podcast episode, I wanted to share a few notes and updates. As always, we encourage you to go to wegrowteachers.com for our professional development services. And I'm pleased to announce that we now have thoughtstretchers.org, which is the landing page for the community that we've been threatening to launch for quite some time. It's been a painstakingly slow process, but we're getting closer and closer. What you'll find on thoughtstretchers.org is the foundational principles and concepts upon which we are looking to grow that community, as well as some places where you can sign up for the email newsletter, which will, of course, let you know when we do officially launch and any subsequent events and happenings. This is all meant to be an extension of our professional development work, and we have indeed begun working with schools on heterodoxy and helping them better understand the principles of liberal inquiry and equipping them with the tools to navigate some of these culture war kinds of issues. If you're interested in any of that, you can reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. Lastly, I wanted to let you know that the next thing you will hear is something that we've not really done here on this podcast before, and that is an advertisement. You'll be hearing the voice of Monica Guzman, who is a previous guest of our podcast and part of Braver Angels, which is my favorite grassroots depolarization organization. I urge you to check out braverangels.org, and for that matter, Monica's book, I Never Thought of It That Way. And if you think you might be interested in joining the network, please give it a listen.
Americans on opposite sides of the political spectrum don't just disagree on the issues. More and more, they can't stand one another. This partisan animosity is the crisis of our time and threatens our nation. Braver Angels is here to address this. Our mission is to bring Americans together to bridge the partisan divide and strengthen our democratic republic. But no single organization, no matter how successful, can be powerful enough all on its own to heal this divide. If our goal is really to strengthen our democratic republic, our only practical strategy is to ignite and shape a broader movement for civic renewal. That's why we started Braver Network. At Braver Network, you'll find organizations from all across the country and all across the political spectrum that even when they disagree on the issues, come together to spark this movement for civic renewal. In building this network, we commit to equal representation, not just between conservatives and liberals, independents and nonpartisan groups, but also between national and community-level organizations. At Braver Network, you'll find the whole gamut, from businesses and leadership organizations to educational and religious institutions, all committed to improving our politics and strengthening our nation. We're looking for leaders and members of all kinds of organizations who are ready to lead and take part in the movement. Joining is completely free, and the opportunities for collaboration are endless. Help turn the tides of toxic polarization. Check out braverangels.org to sign your organization up for Braver Network.
In this episode, I spoke with James Fishback. James is the founder of Incubate Debate, and we talked about that, of course, but started off talking about his educational experience and the ways in which his teachers introduced and valued and incentivized viewpoint diversity and the value of that. Incubate Debate is an organization that he founded in response to problems that he's identified with the National Speech and Debate Association and how judges, in his opinion, and the evidence seems pretty clear to me, that they are introducing ideological tests as criteria for winning and advancing in those competitions. James has a couple articles in the Free Press, which is the news organization founded by Barry Weiss, And you can find out more about the details there and follow him on Twitter/X to see some of the videos that we refer to. But we talked about the critiques, which are the underlying assumptions, and those are the foundation for where the problem seems to be arising. We also talked about the culture that is necessary to reinforce the rules that are in place to keep the ideological purity tests from affecting the judging process. And I also tried to play devil's advocate to give voice to some of the criticisms that folks might have of his ideas and the things that he's claiming. What does seem clear to me is that this is an example of liberal authoritarianism at play, this time on the left, but we also talked about some of those things that happen on the right and the importance of working to insist on the application of liberal inquiry and that objective pluralism that we're emphasizing with our Thought Stretchers community. As always, I hope this conversation is helpful, and without further ado, here's my conversation with James. I am here with James Fishback, and we're going to talk about debate, high school debate, and the work that he's doing in that space. But as I usually like to do, I want to give you an opportunity, James, to say hello and introduce yourself and tell the folks who you are, any background information that might be helpful.
Well, Drew, it's a real pleasure. My name is James Fishback. I'm from Florida, born and raised. I did high school debate. I was a national champion many, many moons ago, but just being in debate profoundly changed who I was, who I am today. I grew up with a really bad stutter as a kid, and so debate, by going to tournaments every other weekend, honing those public speaking skills, helped me overcome that. And debate also opened my mind to a lot of issues that I otherwise would not have been thinking about, other perspectives that I otherwise would not have really engaged with. And so I'm the founder and executive director of a nonprofit called Incubate Debate, which is the largest debate league in Florida and actually the fastest growing in the country. We're now expanding to different parts. We now have a league in South Carolina, looking at other states as well. But yeah, that's the background on me.
So what was your educational, I mean, you mentioned the debate pieces, but I'm curious what your educational experience was just overall, sort of K-12 and then, higher education.
K-12, public school kid, graduated from a Boyd Anderson High School in Lauderdale Lakes, Florida, which is in Broward County, which is a top 5 school district in terms of student population. I then went off to Georgetown in DC, where I studied economics. And it was just really a big change for me because I'd gone to this Title I high school that was BA, Boyd Anderson, and then to go off to Georgetown and to have classes with the sons of Saudi princes and Qatari Emirate and all of that stuff. It was an interesting experience. I think by and large, these elite institutions are overrated. And so I was in some ways humbled by a lot of the experiences I had with professors. But I think in many ways, I came to the conclusion that these people weren't all that different from me and the people that I grew up around. And in many ways, the people I grew up around were far more intelligent, both book smart and street smart, than a lot of the people, and I say this with all respect to them, with a lot of the people that I came across with at Georgetown.
So did you feel like your K-12 experience was positive, negative, kind of middle of the road? Or, when we think about education, and one of the things that we really focus on is inquiry, and I'm always curious when I talk with folks, especially that started something like you started, to think about, or to kind of get a sense of what their educational experience was, because sometimes their work is reactive, right? It's like, that was really bad, and that's got to, I'm going to problem solve in an entrepreneurial kind of way. And I think obviously you've done some of that with the Incubate Debate, and we're going to get into what the problem is that you're trying to solve there. But just to give a little bit more context into how you think about education and what your experience was in that K-12 space, and probably more so, especially, middle school and high school, where it really starts to become a little bit more worldly, I guess.
I had an incredible K-12 experience, and debate for me in high school was that extracurricular that really drove me. But I had some really special teachers along the way from elementary school, middle, and high school who really pushed me. I had some great resources as well. I had a school librarian who presented opposing texts and got me to think outside of the box by presenting alternative viewpoints to a number of key issues and challenged me. Incubate for me wasn't a reaction to anything that I personally went through. When I did high school debate 10, 15 years ago, it wasn't the political and ideological mess that it is today, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, Drew. Incubate was a response to what I encountered as a volunteer debate coach at a similar Title I high school to mine when I came back to South Florida after college in 2017. And it was shocking how debate had transformed from this really neutral academic extracurricular activity that pushed kids, whether they were on the left or the right or neither, to really think about and appreciate different sides of an issue, into something that I really hardly recognized in 2017 and even more so don't recognize today.
Well, if you'll allow me, I'd like to pull a little bit more on that before we get into the specific debate stuff, because you mentioned sort of teachers that were special and the ways in which they presented different viewpoints. And again, one of the things we're working on outside of just sort of pedagogy, and everything we do is, say through the lens of inquiry, but trying to help schools and help solve some of these problems of polarization and corrosive, back and forth, us versus them kind of things. And what we talk about is the idea of objective pluralism and viewpoint diversity and those kinds of things. But putting that into practice is a whole different ball of wax, right? So I'm curious, to the extent that you have any sort of specific memories, some of them certainly in the debate space, but maybe even outside of the debate space, that you remember that teachers did that sort of were consistent with that introduction of different viewpoints and that kind of thing.
It's a great question. And, I think that it wasn't what I remember, it's what I don't remember. And what I don't remember is a highly fragmented, divided school, division between students, between teachers, constant political and ideological nonsense. So to the extent that it was special for me, it wasn't because anything in particular happened or anything that they intentionally did, looking back on it. It was the fact that there was a lack of, rightly so, a lot of what plagues, I believe, K-12 today. I got to be honest, I didn't ever reflect on my race until college. That it never came up in school. I never thought about my race or anyone else's race. We were all Americans. I was in kindergarten when 9/11 happened, and I'll never forget that day. And the school coming together, my dad picking me up that day. So it was a special time. I have such tremendous respect for my teachers, and I especially have respect for them in light of what's happened, I believe, to education over the last, call it 5 or 6 years. And so their ability to stay neutral, to stay objective, perhaps to exemplify that objective pluralism in an unspoken way, instead of a very conspicuous and deliberate, let's come together and talk about how we're all different, but how we're all together kind of thing. That's what was magical for me.
Yeah, interesting. Was there much of a sort of focus that you can recall on sort of scores and points and grades and test scores and that kind of thing?
There was, I was broken up kind of around 3rd or 4th grade. They started splitting up some of the math classes. So if you were advanced math, you'd go to a certain classroom in elementary school when other kids would maybe stay behind and so on. We had actually just started in the early 2000s, the FCAT, which was the sort of Florida's standardized test for elementary school. And so I had exposure to that and saw that firsthand. But nothing really comes to mind right away. I mean, I really didn't even think about the SATs, the ACTs until late sophomore year of high school. Mm-hmm. But I do remember, to your point, Drew, I do remember a very wide array of assessment types. So we had posters, we had class assignments, we had group discussions, we would have in-class debates, we would have short responses, we'd have pop quizzes, we'd have a lot of great field trips, something that it just doesn't seem that happens all that often. So very much experiential learning, and I benefited from that in a big way.
Well, that's the reason I ask is because one of the things that I hypothesize about and people who listen regularly are probably like, oh, here he goes again. But like the sort of culture of achievement and focus on test scores and how it disincentivizes the kind of teaching that you're describing, which I think decades of doing that has sort of had a downstream effect of not producing adults that are sort of looking for that different kind of, challenge of viewpoints and tolerant of the other, looking to understand and be understood as opposed to trying to win arguments and have the answers. But yeah, that's why I asked that. So, well, tell us about Incubate Debate, and we're going to get into, again, the entrepreneurial reason for why you started Incubate Debate, because there are some dynamics at play that I think you're pointing out and worth talking about. So I guess let's first talk about Incubate Debate.
Incubate was my response to what I saw on the ground in South Florida, where after my first tournament with my all-black team at a high school debate tournament, when I'd come back as a volunteer coach, to have a black student be told by a judge that had they not criticized BLM, they would have won the round. They would have won the debate. And it was really all down from there. I mean, the political and ideological bias. I mean, yeah, of course, people are biased. People are biased in this world. For me, as a proud Christian, proud Catholic, it'd be very hard for me to objectively look at a debate about abortion. But it's an educational exercise, and I have to separate my views from how I would adjudicate and grade a debate. But it was awful. And this was not the debate that I knew. This is not the debate that changed my life. I don't think this was the debate that benefited the Oprah Winfreys of the world, the Neil Gorsuches, the Antonin Scalias, the Ketanji Brown Jacksons. And so I was really left with no option. I didn't want to quit debate, but I wanted to quit what was the legacy debate, traditional debate scene run by the National Speech and Debate Association. I knew it, and many of your viewers will know it as the National Forensics League, which was named up until 2014. Incubate Debate started as a no-cost debate camp, the first of its kind in Florida in the summer of 2019. The idea, Drew, was let's take some kids who otherwise would not be able to go to a debate camp, which could, even a local camp could set them back $2,000 to $3,000, and let's train them in the art of debate. Let's train them in rhetoric and how to develop argumentations and how to research, how to rebut, how to separate the idea from the person, how to disagree agreeably. We did that for 2 weeks at the University of Miami. And then we sent those kids off into the world, into the legacy tournaments, thinking that, okay, we have 16 kids, maybe they'll go and influence and make debate better and really bring it back to what it was when I was in it, and so many others. And they did a great job of it. I think they did their best, but still, it wasn't enough to train kids and then send them back into this broken system. The system actually had to be built up. There had to be an alternative to it. And so when the pandemic came around, all of the big tournaments, Harvard, Yale, Nationals, they all went online. They all went to Zoom. And so that was the first time we said, wait, hold on a second, maybe we can host tournaments. Because now the barrier to entry wasn't you need a convention center in Dallas with 25 rooms and a $30,000 down payment. The barrier to entry was a $6 Zoom account, which we had already shelled out. And so come the fall of 2020, we hosted our first tournament online. And a couple things were different about an Incubate tournament. One, we did not charge anybody anything. And so that's not something that the other tournament leagues can say, because in the midst of a pandemic where 20 million people lost their jobs, where millions were thrown into poverty, it was the biggest disruption in 100 years for the average American family, that these debate leagues, traditional leagues, were still charging kids $100, $200 to compete in an online tournament via Zoom from the comfort of their own bedroom. And so we said the tournament's going to be free. We also didn't require, for the first time ever, we did not require students to bring a parent to judge. That's actually a requirement to this day in the legacy debate world, is that if a young student wants to participate in a debate tournament, mom, dad, or some other adult has to come with them, not to supervise, but to fulfill their obligation to the tournament, to provide a judge who would then go on to judge other students during the day for 6-8 hours. As you could imagine, Drew, that's a non-starter for a lot of families in this economy. And so imagine if high school football was conditional, your participation was conditional on mom or dad being at every single game. We wouldn't have a lot of the football stars that we have today. And so between no cost and no judge requirement, we thought that was going to help us drive some registration. We thought maybe 40, 50. Again, we just worked with 16 kids. We thought maybe 40 or 50 would show up. Well, it turns out that over 200 showed up that day. And they were judged not by their parents, who were not required to be there, but they were judged by professors, think tank researchers, elected officials. We had Glenn Greenwald, Bill Ackman, a whole host of really special people from both sides of the political aisle come out and adjudicate a number of really good debates. And then we thought, hold on a second, we've got something here. We've got an online tournament format. We can reach kids. We got kids from 6 states at that first tournament. No judge requirement, no cost. Let's try to keep doing this. And we kept doing it online for about a year or so. We went in person, and I'm happy to report today that there are over 5,000 active students in our program that come to our tournaments across 7 independent chapters in Florida and in South Carolina to debate 4 times a year on some really timely and timeless issues.
So how does that compare in scale? 'Cause it's impressive to have that growth, and yeah. I'm imagining that the National Speech and Debate Association, NSDA, is a pretty big organization. I don't know, are they still a big organization? How does that sort of compare in scale to them?
We're smaller, but we're growing quicker, and we're growing for all the right reasons. And, they have about 150,000 active students on their roster. We have 5,000. As we continue to grow, we're going to bring more and more students into debate because students want to be able to actually have real conversations, to inquire about what's happening in the world, and then to be judged fairly in the process.
Okay, so let's talk about the actual structure that you experienced as a student. And is before we get to the sort of substance, so the pieces that you're sort of trying to problem solve, is the structure the same, or has it changed over the years in the way that the actual events and the debates are set up and executed?
Not really. The structure itself hasn't changed. When I was in high school, we had what are called judge paradigms. And judge paradigms are these online profiles that the judges put out to the students before the round starts. And so 10, 15 years ago, the way a judge paradigm worked is, if Drew, you were judging a tournament, you might put in your paradigm before the tournament, I would prefer if you don't speak 300 words a minute, and I prefer primary source over secondary source evidence. And that might be the entirety of your paradigm, right? Essentially, it's what is your judging philosophy? Mm-hmm. And so students can reflect on that and act accordingly. So paradigms are still here. The problem is they don't reflect on stylistic or procedural ideas. They've become full-blown political and ideological litmus tests. And so my first article for the Free Press back in May started off with an example of a judge named Lila Lavender. And Lila is actually the 2019 National Collegiate Debate Champion. And her paradigm tells students before, this is the key, before the debate, that she is, quote, a Marxist, Leninist Maoist, cannot check that at the door, and as a result will no longer evaluate and thus ever vote for the following arguments, which included normalizing Israel, defending the police, defending the U.S., and supporting capitalism. And so you could imagine a young 14-year-old girl who spent the last 2 months up at night preparing her cases, getting her arguments ready, to walk into a round to only be judged by someone like Lila Lavender and thinking, despite all my work, despite all my efforts, I do not have a shot.
So the structure, because I'm imagining lots of folks, myself included, like I understand the idea of debate, of course, but I've not been at one of these events. I've seen some of them online. Some of the things that you're talking about, like 300 words a minute, I've seen this like crazy. I mean, it feels crazy. They're speaking like a podcast on 10 times, right? It seems really bizarre just to look at from the outside. But what is the sort of structure? And I'm imagining maybe there's several different ways, right? So is it that there are 2 or 3 or 4 students in this process, and then there's a number of judges, or like structurally, what does that look like?
It usually looks something like there's 2 teams. So you've got anywhere between 1 to 2 students on team A, 1 to 2 students depending on the exact format in team B.
Okay.
And then the vast majority of time, there's only 1 judge in the room. And those are the preliminary rounds. When you start getting into quarterfinal, semifinal, and final, you start to build out a panel. But even that doesn't fix the problem, the underlying judge bias problem. A lot of judges will agree with what this judge said from my first piece in the Free Press, was that if you merely mention the word illegal immigrant, you automatically lose the round. That alone is considered hate speech in their mind, and that alone will result in your loss in the round. And so even if judges don't explicitly state that in their paradigm, they still hold that view, and they still hold that against a student. And that's no way for a forum of open inquiry and open debate to be held.
So without those ideological pieces, what is it supposed to look like? Like, what's the criteria or the lens through which they're, I guess they award points, as you're saying, yeah. And so you either win or lose based on numbers of points. Is it like scoring per rounds, or how does that, like, ideally is it supposed to look?
It's usually a straight binary, so it's a win or a loss. You win or you lose any given round. Everyone does, say, 4 or 5 rounds at the beginning of a tournament, and then the students who, let's say, win 4 out of 5 rounds, they then advance to the quarterfinal, they then advance to the semifinal, and so on. In terms of rubric, there's a number of ways to look at it, but the best way is, what arguments did Team A make? What arguments did Team B make? Did Team A respond to the arguments from Team B against Team A, and how did Team B respond in turn? And so this idea of a dropped argument is, if Team A says this is going to cause some sort of geopolitical crisis, but Team B does not sufficiently respond to that claim, that becomes a problem. And so they allow that to stand. So anything that is not questioned is deemed allowed to stand. But there's different approaches to this. And so you've got judges who are what are called tech, and judges who are truth. Tech judges just look at the technicalities of the round, right? Who put points on the board, who made the arguments without any reference to what they believe to be true or not. Truth judges will kind of weigh in a little bit more. If a person says that, there was a nuclear crisis 2 years ago in China, and that isn't true, they'll then factor that in. But bigger than tech and truth is that what united all of these people 10 or 15 years ago was merit, that the best argument ought to win the day. That very clearly, and it's a low bar, Drew, because I'm sure we'll talk about it in a second, but what I've been sharing on X recently in my reporting is that you have teams, nationally ranked high school debate teams, who walk into a debate round where the topic is whether the benefits of the International Monetary Fund outweigh the costs. And they reject the topic entirely, and then instead talk about a much more pressing social justice issue like transgenderism or so on. And so that's a pretty low bar, is to say that the team who wins is the team who sticks to the topic and debates the topic. And yet there are teams who currently hold national championships who, for the entirety of the tournament, including and especially the final round, did not address the topic in any way, shape, or form.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, you and I might be debating one another, and we show up, whether it's in person and obviously some of them are online because I see examples of those, and we're supposed to debate, the merits of the International Monetary Fund, for example. And instead, because that's not ideologically okay, the one team just talks about something completely different?
That's right.
Okay.
Now, this grew. This has been going on for a while, but it's certainly not as bad as it is today. So the idea was, it's called the critique argument. You would challenge the underlying assumption of the topic. And so if the topic was something about capitalism, and the topic, the way you believe it was written, was that capitalism was a good thing, that it was a unequivocal positive, your critique might be to criticize the topic and say that we can't debate this because it assumes that capitalism is good. Capitalism is not good, right? And so if someone presented a topic to you that said, how does race-based affirmative action benefit Black students? I might think about that, and I don't know your personal views on affirmative action. My personal view is that it does not benefit Black students. Rather, how does race-based affirmative action benefit? That's the key word, benefit. I would say that we can't debate that topic because it assumes that race-based affirmative action is good. It is not. Here's why. And we have a reasonable debate about that. But what's happening now, though, is they're saying we can't debate the IMF because trans kids are being misgendered in debate. And that constitutes violence. And as a result, we have to debate and talk about transgenderism as opposed to the International Monetary Fund.
And they're not making the claim that trans violence is related to the underlying assumption of the matter at hand. Okay.
Correct. There's no link, right? And that's what the idea with critiques were 10, 15 years ago, is they only were suitable if there was some link to the topic. And so to the capitalism point, to the affirmative action point, we can establish a link there, but there's not even a pretext of a link here at all. And so what's concerning is that I think we can be captured and amazed by what happened in one or two rounds. But let's talk about big data in aggregate. 2/3 of national debate, high school debate judges have said that they will evaluate these newfound critique arguments in the same way that they evaluate arguments addressing the topic. And when you have 2 out of 3 judges who are saying that an argument about transgenderism in a debate about the IMF is okay, then you have an event that is no longer what it purports to be. Inquiry, debate, merit, civility. When you can hijack the round and make it about whatever you want it to be about and then win on those terms, that is not a debate.
And if I'm correct, and I think I've seen this, critique is spelled differently with like a K. Is it Kritik?
Yeah.
Is there a reason for that, or is that just some shorthand?
It's the German version.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so what is another team, if I come to this debate with you and you say, no, we have to talk about trans violence, what does the other team tend to do? I wasn't prepared to talk about this, and do I just sit there? Am I I'm just curious. What happens in those?
They really paint him in a corner, because if the student then says, wait, this debate is about the IMF, not about trans violence, then the team gets more belligerent and says, wait, are you denying that trans genocide is real? Are you denying that that is the case? That is transphobic. And so what teams end up doing is they'll end up running critiques against critiques. We saw this in a round that I posted last week, the quarterfinal round of the 2021 Tournament of Champions, the most prestigious high school debate tournament in the country. And the first team started with the critique about transgenderism, again, same IMF topic. And the other team said, no, what's more important is Black feminism, and Black feminism subsumes transgenderism because Black women are trans at disproportionate rates. And it was like one of those Spider-Man meets Spider-Man memes. And it was like a hall of mirrors. You didn't even know what was going on. And at one point, and it was just wrong. At one point, the debate it devolved into the second team telling the first team that we better represent this progressive activist advocacy because we are both people of color and one of your team members is white, and whiteness is inherently bad.
Yeah. Well, as you were describing it, that's where my mind went. I thought, well, maybe I come back with a higher moral claim than, if you're gonna claim we have to talk about this moral issue, then I might talk about that moral issue, and it sounds like that's what's happening. How many judges are there in total, and do you have a sense of how many of those judges are, I guess, would fall in that category of this sort of ideological capture?
It's tough to know how many judges are there. The NSDA says there's 40,000, and they use that number from the number of paradigms that are online. But just a cursory look will show you that a lot of these judges haven't judged in years, and those who do judge might only judge one or two tournaments. What I focus on more, Drew, is the judges who judge frequently and who have strong influence in the high school debate community, which is bigger than judging. Do they coach at camps? Were they former high school or collegiate champions? And that gives them clout, that gives them prestige. So when they go around and say these things and adjudicate in the way that they do, it seems completely normal and no one questions it. What's sad is that even if you give the National Speech and Debate Association, coming up on its 100th birthday in a couple of years, even if you give them the benefit of the doubt about everything that I've said, and I broke in my reporting in May and then in a follow-up article in June, then why didn't they say anything about this? They put out a word salad of a statement 48 hours after my article dropped in the Free Press, choosing not to respond to 7 requests for comment in the lead up to the article. But in that article, Drew, in their statement rather, they did not condemn, they did not denounce, they did not dismiss these judges. And so we had unequivocal evidence from the online profiles using the judges' words, their own words, saying things like, if you're white, don't talk about how issues affect Black students. One judge who went as far as imposing her own racial regime on the kids in the round. She said, if you're Black, you don't have to disclose evidence to your opponents, handing your evidence over. But if you aren't Black, you do. And so, wait, what on earth is that? That's racism. That's racial discrimination. The judges who say you can make conservative arguments, but be careful. So we laid this all out for them in part 1 for the Free Press, and they chose not to discipline, not to remove, not to suspend any of these judges. In fact, what I broke at the beginning of last week is that Lila Lavender, the self-proclaimed Marxist-Leninist Maoist who can never bring herself to voting for someone who defends Israel and their right to exist, she has actually judged 31 rounds of debate so far this school year. And so it continues unabated. And what does that mean? It means that the reporting that I did, I think, was important. But what was way more important than that was the NSDA's lack of response to this reporting. And so that is the ultimate test of how I believe they are a corrupted organization. They've lost their way. They've become too political and ideological. When someone hands them the receipts, an article that is promulgated by prominent Republicans and Democrats saying that this issue, this viewpoint diversity discrimination is wrong, that they do absolutely nothing about it. That is way more telling than anything I could have pointed out from judges and their statements.
So with these judges, there must be some sort of training process and protocols for expectations and qualities that they're supposed to exhibit, right? I can't imagine that there aren't. Are there pieces in that training and in those sort of protocols and guidelines and expectations that reasonably could be used as tools to sort of say, basically we don't allow judges, or we don't want judges to judge based on ideology and orthodoxy and identitarianism, those kinds of things?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And let me read you the NSDA's rule on this. They say, quote, judges should decide the round as it's debated, not based on their personal beliefs. And so, as you know, as I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, there is a difference between the rule and whether or not you enforce it. This is the NSDA's rule on paper.
Right.
They have chosen not to enforce it time and again. And when the biggest high school debate story dropped and everyone was talking about this, they had an opportunity via that press statement. I'm not saying kick these judges out for good. I'm not saying cancel them. Give them an opportunity to come back and to reflect. But in the meantime, they should have been suspended and should not have been allowed to judge debates. These debates determine which kids win, which kids get championship medals, which kids get scholarships, what colleges they go to. And so what is more anti-inquiry and anti-merit and anti-debate than saying before a debate, you can't make certain arguments? So to your point, Drew, this breaks their rules, but because they've chosen not to enforce their rules, there are in fact no rules.
So I'm imagining that at the startup, the work that you're doing with Incubate Debate, you've got similar rules. You've got some things in place, right? And one thing that I think is really important to recognize, and you think about free speech and free expression, and the things that we have in place for that I would say align with the founding ideals of the country, that those things can and must be in place structurally, rules and guidelines and kinds of things, but they're not enough. They're necessary but not sufficient, right? So there has to be sort of a culture. There has to be those things that incentivize the ways in which we lean into those instead of leaning away from them. So I'm curious, maybe a two-part question here. One, what do you imagine has been the sort of impetus for, sounds like NSDA sort of departing from that culture, and what are the things that you with Incubate Debate do to reinforce that culture?
That's a great question, and I really like how you framed it, Drew. The idea of necessary, but not sufficient. Yes, having written rules, written guidelines about what is okay and what is not okay, that is absolutely a necessity. But it alone does not guarantee the kind of environment that we want to see for students, right? A lot of these students think this is a rigged game because if they simply toe the judge's own politics and ideology, they'll succeed. Our approach has been radically different. We have written the rules as such to make it clear to our judges beforehand that this is an educational activity. This is not activism. This is not advocacy. That students regularly talk about and advocate for positions that they themselves disagree with. It is a competition. It is a means to an end, and that end is critical thinking. It's discourse. It's civic disposition. It is the free exchange of ideas. It's free expression. And so we check all those boxes, I think. But where Incubate succeeds where the NSDA doesn't is we actually enforce those rules. We actually enforce them. And so we do a couple things. We don't just rely on the fact that judges read our rubric and our rule sheet and hold them to their word. We actually, every round of debate at Incubate, from the preliminaries to semis to the very final championship round, has multiple judges present, multiple judges. And those judges come from the community that our students come from. So whereas high school debates, the highest debates in high school, the championship final rounds, the ones that I posted on X this past week, they were all judged by former high school debaters. And so what a coincidence. The very people that are adjudicating the rounds are the very people who just 2-3 years ago were running the exact same nonsense in those rounds. And it becomes a vicious cycle where no one really knows why, or no one really thinks that anyone's doing anything wrong. So the first thing we do is recruiting. We recruit judges from the community. So at an Incubate Debate tournament, the young men and women who participate, they're judged by local elected officials, first responders, business owners and operators, district attorneys, members of law enforcement, faith-based leaders. That's the first thing we do. And so we don't have to tell our judges that students have to debate the topic, and if they don't evaluate them. We don't need to tell the police officer who's judging a debate about Remain in Mexico or about electric vehicles that if a student goes on there and blabs about climate change, that is not something to be evaluated. So I think the first thing is our pipeline, where we get our judges from, who they are. They represent the very best of our communities in Florida and in South Carolina. And the second thing that we do is we actually enforce the rules. And so enforcing the rules is important for the obvious reason that if the rules are broken, it skews the outcome. But if the rules are perceived to be broken or compromised, it also creates this aura of impropriety. It creates this idea that the game is not fair. And so I'll give you one example. We had an online tournament a couple years ago, and the debate was whether the U.S. should ban the short selling of stocks. The idea that a hedge fund manager could sell a stock that he doesn't own to profit from its decline. And we had Leon Cooperman, who your listeners may know is a well-known hedge fund manager. We had him judge the round. And At the end of the round, he made a comment during our oral judge feedback session. We're also very proud to say that we're the only debate league that offers students real-time oral feedback right after the debate. Your listeners will know the power of the immediacy of feedback, and that oral feedback is far more powerful than written feedback received 2 weeks later. But he made this comment about a student and about her viewpoint, and said that it's kind of skewed towards socialism. And so in that moment, it was pretty clear to us what we had to do. We didn't hesitate. We threw out his ballot, which means his rankings were not considered in the final decision for who ended up winning that tournament and who ended up getting second, third, and fourth. And we also told students what we did. We said that because of the comment you heard, it wasn't anything nasty or malicious. It was just a comment that compromised his ability to be impartial. And even if, and I actually didn't look at his rankings, but even if he ended up ranking that girl that he subtly criticized her views for, even if he had ranked her highly, it would have still compromised the image of the round. And so to kind of bring it all back, because I've been going for a little bit here, Drew, is 3 things we do. We have the rules, we enforce the rules, and the people that we have come out to our tournaments, they are not the people who judge the NSDA. I have a lot of respect for former debaters, but I don't have respect for former debaters who did this a year or 2 ago and are running the exact same nonsense and really viewing in the rounds what they want to see, as opposed to what the average American who'd be watching these debates. And so I think those 3 differentiators is why Incubate Debate continues to grow and is the largest debate league in Florida today.
So are these judges that you're noticing and referring to that are sort of compromised in their process and the way that they're doing this, are they all, or it sounds like primarily at least, but I guess maybe a different way to ask this, are there judges who are not sort of using a sort of leftist kind of illiberal ideology as the foundation for whatever, reasons for disqualification of ideas and this and that and the other? I mean, I guess are there sort of outside of those that you've mentioned, that Maoist and Marxist and those kinds of things, which classify as leftist, are there ones that are on the right that maybe super uber fundamentalist Christian or something like that?
The answer is no, and I have not been able to find one. I was actually hoping to find one. My personal experience, I never came across one, but as I was writing these pieces for the Free Press, I was actually hoping that there would be one example so we could give that other side of the story. I read thousands of paradigms, Drew. I couldn't find one example. And I think it's because the very people who would do that would be kicked out of debate very quickly, either directly or indirectly. Indirectly being they would no longer feel welcome. They'd be ostracized. And so the idea that, and it's not just former debaters, it's also current debate coaches who were debaters eons ago, who encourage, reward, and allow this type of nonsense. Not everybody is a self-proclaimed Marxist, Leninist, Maoist. Most of these people, I know them very well. They're very good people. The problem is they cannot separate their politics from their job. Their job is to rank the round. Their job is to adjudicate the debate. Their job is to deliver an impartial outcome for the students who worked so hard to get to where they are. And so to your question, no, I haven't seen anything. And I've really tried hard on the conservative side. I mean, if you could imagine for a second what would have happened if Lila Lavender, instead of saying she's a self-proclaimed Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, itself, she's a self-proclaimed America First MAGA Republican who can no longer evaluate arguments ranging from open borders are good to defunding the police. I don't know that the NSDA would have kept her around very, very long. She probably would have got the disciplinary action that she should have actually gotten in that statement that was put out after my reporting. So no, it has become an echo chamber that is entirely, I don't say liberal because it's really not liberal. Liberal is open inquiry, free expression, and debate. It is an illiberal leftism is what it really is, and it's ruining this once cherished activity.
So let me play devil's advocate here, and I, when I say what I'm going to say, I'm not saying it in a way to minimize in any way the experience of debate, but as I'm thinking, like, what's a reasonable sort of steel man or something like that, right? So in some sense, debate might be viewed as a game, right? It's like we're not talking about high stakes things outside of the sort of realm of debate and championships. I mean, there's a competition there, so there's some high stakes there, but most people aren't, striving for debate championships, right? So somebody might look at this from afar and say, well, this is just a game, and just like you trying to get into college or whatever, like if it's rigged towards this, just play the game and you learn how to play the game, and what's the big deal? It is what it is, and if that's part of the game, then just play the game, and if you win or lose, then whatever. But we're not talking about changing the course of history or something so dramatic like that. So what's the big deal, I guess?
Yeah. It's actually, that is the number one counterpoint from the debate community. I'll say that most people read my work and say, wow, this is really messed up what's happening. Almost all the pushback comes from people inside the high school debate community, existing coaches and students and former national champion debaters. So I would really push back first and say it's all a game. I don't think it's a game. I don't think a math competition is a game. I think a math competition is a rigorous analytical exercise. And what do I mean by that? Is that if a math competition is a game and you do whatever it takes to win that game, then you should be okay with sneaking in your TI-84 and cheating at that math competition. If debate is a game and you do whatever it takes to win that game, there is no point at which you will stop and say, what I'm doing is wrong. What I'm doing is akin to cheating. And that's why students will end up hijacking these rounds, and it'll end up hurting people. It actually hurts students. The young girl who was attacked for being white, the student who was attacked because of his tweet. Yes, a tweet that he sent out weeks prior to the actual debate tournament that his team deemed politically controversial. They then hijacked what was supposed to be a debate about water policy and made it all about his politically incorrect tweet in which he defended the First Amendment. The judge then sided with the team that attacked him and then went on to excoriate the student for being a racist homophobe. So the core of this, the assumption is that debate is a game. And a game is something that you can cheat at in a sense. And I would say that winning without honor is not winning at all. And this is not a game where you play it and you're done. This is a game where students really for the first time are engaging with opinions other than their own and their families, where they are being exposed to a wide range of viewpoints and perspectives. So they're trying to practice civic disposition and civil discourse, and they're being rewarded for talking about microaggressions, social justice issues that are relevant to the debate topic at hand, and personal ad hominem attacks. And the same students who did that are the same students who will run around campus and do that to their fellow peers, will do that and dox people and cancel people and make people feel bad about their immutable characteristics. So I would take issue with the idea that it is a game. It's really an academic extracurricular. Winning without honor is not winning at all. And the skills that they are being encouraged to build, that they are being rewarded for, the ad hominem attacks, the political echo chamber, all of that, those don't just end the moment the game is over. Those continue. They carry those really bad habits with them into the real world, past high school, into college, into their career. And that's why a lot of these students will convulse when they meet a Trump supporter. They'll quiver when they meet someone who is of the other opinion of them on whether there's a climate emergency. And we need Americans who are graduating high school today to not agree with the other side, but to respect the other side. And when debates are set up like this, they do the exact opposite.
So I'm imagining another significant pushback that you get is, sort of related to, if folks are familiar, Greg Lukianoff and Ricky Schlott have a new book called Canceling of the American Mind. And I'm in the middle of reading it, but I've heard them talk quite a bit about this sort of perfect rhetorical fortress, right? And one of the tricks of that perfect rhetorical fortress is you can just label somebody as a conservative and you don't even have to listen to their arguments. So You and I have not met prior to this conversation. I don't know your politics, but obviously you're sort of pointing out something on the left, which then makes it easy to assume, say, well, James probably is some at least center right, maybe even far right, and then to add fuel to the fire, like in preparation for this, I looked up. All right, where's James been? Of course, some people would say, Barry Weiss and the Free Press, which is where you got that. They're conservative, they're right wing, and versions of that. They say that about fire, all that kind of thing. You've been on the Charlie Kirk show, which certainly is pretty far right, and people say, well, look, here's a guy who's flirting with these sort of far right kinds of people. So we don't have to listen to him. Number one, and two, he's just pushing this sort of MAGA-ish, whatever you want to call it, kind of agenda. So I imagine you get that kind of pushback, and how do you respond to that?
I have gotten that pushback. And what I would say to that is open debate is not political. Free inquiry and the exchange of ideas is not political. It wasn't political until about 20 minutes ago when all of a sudden we started talking about we need to debate more as a country. You were labeled as some far-right maniac. The lack of debate has gotten this country in a lot of trouble recently. The pandemic was an awful example of what happens when we as a country don't get to debate the big issues that are then going to in turn, in fact, affect us. And so think about school lockdowns. We never really had a real debate about that. And when you push back online, you actually got censored on sites like Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter 1.0, of course. The vaccine mandates for kids, forced masking for kids, lockdowns for businesses, distance learning. We could go on and probably spend another hour just talking about the specific quantifiable effects of lockdowns, of forced masking, and so on. But what all of those policies had in common is they happened at a time when we did not scrutinize what was being presented. We could not scrutinize, debate, and discuss what was being presented because the media was all one way on one issue. Big tech was actively pushing the scale and censoring people. We remember the posts that were labeled as misinformation and disinformation and were taken down or de-amplified and not allowed to be shared. And so what I would say to all of this is that I'm an unapologetic conservative. I am proud that Barry Weiss, who is an unapologetic progressive, would publish this work. But I also think that the people who shared the work and who it resonated with most were also Democrats. People like Larry Summers, Treasury Secretary under President Clinton, Ro Khanna, one of the most progressive members of the House of Representatives, sharing this work saying viewpoint discrimination is bad. Whether the right does it or the left does it, it is bad. It is un-American, and it is not how we move forward as a country. So I'm going to take this message to any venue that I can, to any show, to any podcast. I'm grateful for the invitation, Drew. Although I don't think you're as controversial as Charlie Kirk, I'm grateful for the invitation.
Nowhere am I trying to be.
I'm grateful for it. But at the end of the day, it's about getting this message out to the most number of Americans that I can. I really wished CNN had actually reached out during when the article came out and wanted to do something. It didn't end up working with their schedule. I was really hoping that CNN would bring me on or MSNBC would bring me on. But I think the work speaks for itself. This is very little of what I've written is my opinion. Very little is anonymous reporting, or none of it actually is anonymous reporting. None of it is anything that's personally happened to me. The entirety of what I've put out is verbatim what judges have said. All of those statements were online when the articles came out. Many of them are still online today, fully documented. And a lot of it they're just videos of the judges in their own words. So I just don't see how somebody could say that just because you went on Charlie Kirk, just because you went on Fox News, that discredits your reporting. I think actually that's part of the problem, is that just because the people say that just because Fox News said something that means it's false, that just because I went on Fox to talk about this, the reporting, I'm proud to say, speaks for itself because it's all primary source. It pulls direct quotes. It's verbatim. We have the receipts. And my hope is that people will have an honest conversation, not just about high school debate. I don't think everyone who read the article necessarily is passionate as much as I am about high school debate. But what they do see is they see the bigger issue at hand, which is that high school debate represents the decline of debate in America over the past decade. And that should worry us all.
Well, it really is interesting. And as you think about how our media has retreated to these camps, and there's so much narrative journalism at this point, I would imagine it's increasingly hard, incredibly hard to try to figure out how do I navigate that, because there really aren't a lot, maybe one could argue any sort of very sort of neutral, at least certain, not on cable news. I mean, Fox is clearly, leverages conflict and does some conflict entrepreneurship. Charlie Kirk, I would guess, falls in that. I don't really pay much attention to him, but from what I see, but then certainly like MSNBC and CNN to some extent, right? So where do you go? And it seems like you see people either going to one side or the other, and very little crossover. I think that's a problem with our media ecosystem. One of the things that, and I'm curious how you might think about this kind of thing, and sort of taking a step back outside of, because obviously your area of focus here is just the debate piece that we're talking about. My sense is, and one of my biggest concerns and work that we're actually doing in the K-12 space, is to really help people better identify the sort of a liberal authoritarianism that I see very clearly on both left and right, and to help people understand what they're really signing up for when they sort of glom onto these whether it's on the left or whether it's on the right. My sense is that most people don't, because they don't think about it. They don't really think about illiberalism, and why would they? Because they're busy living their lives. But to help them have some clarity on that, and then recognize what are the pieces that are sort of foundational to the ideals of this country, and how we can focus on those. So I'm curious how you think about that. I mean, you've clearly identified in the debate space some illiberalism and authoritarianism on the left. Do you feel that, and it doesn't have to be symmetrical and equal, but do you feel that on the right as well?
Of course. Yeah, I think that there are examples you can look to where I think the right has compromised its own values, and especially with respect to the First Amendment, examples through history, even common current day examples. But I think the very idea of trying to pin the tail on the donkey, right? Who deserves more blame for the illiberal authoritarianism that we're seeing, is really the wrong way to think about it. It actually caves into that same dynamic. And so what we have to do is, I believe, set up some pretty basic truths about this, that you should be able to disagree, should not be called names for doing so. You certainly shouldn't be censored and pulled off social media for having a different opinion. Separate the message from the messenger. Disagree agreeably. You don't have to agree with the other side, but you have to respect and appreciate where they're coming from. And if we do that, I don't think this is a 50-50 issue. It's probably a 90-10 issue. There's 10% of the country who believes that even debating certain issues, that debating the transgender issue, is an insult to the humanity of trans people. And I just don't see how we can move forward as a country if we believe that a confused 14-year-old girl should get a double mastectomy for something that we're not allowed to have really an honest debate on. That's not some kind of axiomatic rule that says that that's proven. And so as a country, we've had our best days, our most consequential days, when we've had open debate. Our independence was driven by the debates at the Continental Congress. Our Constitution was driven by the debates at the Constitutional Convention. The civil rights legislation was driven by passionate and vigorous debates on the floor of the Senate in the 1960s. And the present is no different. Debate is the way forward. There's blame to go to both sides on this issue, but that inquiry, that expression, that conversation, we've got to be able to embrace it. Otherwise, we are in big trouble.
Yeah, well, you'll get no arguments here, and I'll put a plug in for our Thought Stretchers community, which we're developing to hopefully foster and grow that, because I do think K-12 in debate certainly has a role in that as well, in helping us get through. Hopefully there is a good result on the other side of more liberal inquiry and pluralism and those kinds of things. So, well, I'm mindful of time, and I want to make sure, so Incubate Debate, is it incubatedebate.com?
We got all of our bases covered. We got incubatedebate.com and incubatedebate.org.
Okay. So what else do we need to know about Incubate Debate, and what haven't we talked about? And then, of course, any other resources or links or things you want to share?
I think we covered a lot of it, Drew. Thank you for the time, for being able to share thoughts today. I would encourage anybody who has thoughts on this to just get in touch. Just email me directly. I'm at james@incubatedebate.org. I didn't predict what was going to happen over the last 6 months. I was surprised as anyone that the articles resonated the way that they did and drew the attention. We were fortunate to get some really, really substantial backing as a result of them. We've seen our numbers more than double in the past 6 months in terms of schools in Florida. The new South Carolina League has come on the back of the coverage from the articles. And so I didn't know what the last 6 months were going to look like before. I don't know what the next 6 months are going to look like. We're really taking it day by day here at Incubate. And so if anybody has any ideas, anything they'd like to share, anything that we could maybe partner up on or compare notes on, I'd be grateful for it. And I would just have them, I'd just ask if they could kindly reach out to me at james@incubatedebate.org.
And you said that these are free for students to attend, right?
Yep. Everything that we do is no cost.
So if I'm running, I'm a department head in Georgia or wherever, and I said, boy, I think I'd like to start a debate team or administrator or whatever, what would that look like? And I guess the other question is, like, if it's free, somebody's paying for it. Who's funding this? It's got to be some right-wing hedge fund thing, right?
Yeah, it's of course. To the question of who's funding this, tell you the truth, I've really been funding it for several years up until just recently when we got a lot of outside donations as our capacity and the demand for what we've been offering has grown. Our donations are from both sides. We've got strong donors who are Democrats, strong donors who are Republicans, who are united by the fact that they see something wrong with competitive debate in the country, and they want to see it come back in a way that it hasn't been in a while. In terms of what to do next for someone who's interested, I would just say get in touch. We are, we're really taking it day by day here. The South Carolina League was the result of a really special school board member from Beaufort County, South Carolina, reaching out to me saying we'd love to do something. Rubber met the road. We made it happen. And so we're really open to a number of things. We're exploring some potential national rollouts in terms of independent chapters for the coming school year, but I'm always happy to chat anytime with anybody about what they're thinking. Okay, well, folks, you've got his email address, and we'll put that and the link to the various URLs in the show notes, that kind of thing. So, James, it's been a pleasure. It's certainly, if folks go onto the artist formerly known as Twitter and see the videos, they really are quite astounding. I mean, they're video clips and they're short, and I'm always hesitant or leery to make a whole lot of judgments. I mean, if nothing else, you have to see the speed talking thing. It's just quite wild. But the sort of identitarianism and things that you'll see there, it's almost hard to watch in a way. So I definitely recommend folks do that. And again, thanks so much for the time. My pleasure, Drew. My pleasure.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.